Hello, thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of Barnard College and Women in Hollywood, it is my honor to welcome you to the 11th annual Athena Film Festival. Our festival is dedicated to celebrating stories of bold, courageous women leaders and the filmmakers who bring these stories to life. So thank you very much for joining us. My name is Corey Luco, and I am a programmer and operations assistant with the festival. I'd like to take a quick moment to acknowledge our sponsors because this festival would not be possible without the support of our dedicated sponsors. So please join me in thanking Athena's founding sponsor, the Artemis Rising Foundation, and its CEO and founder, Regina K. Scully, whose visionary leadership makes our work possible. And then also a special thank you to our premier level sponsor, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which shares our commitment to showcasing stories of women in science and then bringing those stories to you. To all of our sponsors whose names you will see before each film and event, thank you for your commitment to challenging our culture to be more inclusive and inspiring our audiences in the process. This year, for our virtual festival, we wanted to create something new and exciting to bring to our audience. So we are programming in 8 different program areas that we believe react and respond to our current moment. This conversation is part of our Tear It Down, Dismantling White Supremacy program area. In this program area, we take a look at people organizing and taking action to tear down systems of oppression, specifically white supremacy. This panel is called the Push for Decarceration and is an important part of our Tear It Down program area. This panel and the Tear It Down program area is sponsored by Hanky Panky, so thank you very much for that. I am pleased to welcome Adri Rose, who is our moderator for this conversation. Adri is a Pittsburgh-based freelance writer, portrait photographer, and photojournalist focusing on sex, health, Black life, and Black culture in the Rust Belt. Also, to do a quick image description for myself, I am a 26-year-old white woman. I have short chin-length hair. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses. I'm wearing a red sweater, and I have a rainbow flag behind me. Adri, take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adri, last name Rose. As stated earlier, I am a freelance writer and photographer from Pittsburgh. I'm also a former sex worker, so the topic of decarceration is incredibly important to me. As for an image description, I'm a 27-year-old Black woman. I have curly black hair in a ponytail, and I'm wearing pink translucent framed glasses. And I'm so excited to be here today to talk with my angel, Cody. I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is My Angel Cody. I am a lawyer and the founder of the Decarceration Collective Law Office. We are a small but mighty team of women fighting to free people sentenced to life in prison for drugs, and also fighting to end the unfair policies that put them there. To provide a visual description, I am a Black woman. I have a short blonde buzz cut. I have very intentionally large hoop earrings to compensate for my lack of hair. And I have on a black shirt with puffy sleeves.
All right, let's go ahead and dive right on in. I do have a couple of questions, but for those who maybe have not seen the documentary yet, would you talk a little bit about some of the stories that you covered?
Sure, yeah. So this documentary, it is the product of years of work, starting when I was a federal public defender in Chicago. I became very interested in telling my clients' stories to judges because what I saw too often was that the system turns people into numbers, right? And so, case numbers, numbers of the sentence that they were facing, numbers, the amount of drugs that were involved, and it's just sort of pulverizing people to numbers. And I was always very interested in their human stories. And I wanted to figure out a way to communicate that to decision makers in their cases. And so I started recording my clients and their family members and using that with judges and also ultimately sending it to the White House for clemency efforts as well. So, I had all this like footage in my attorney files, and the film's director, Nicole Jones, reached out to me and said, we think there's an interesting story here just about, people's lives and how you're telling their stories, but also your team. So that started the filming of this. It was really an organic experience. I was recording my clients' stories and for court, and thought that my audience would just be judges, and then years later, a larger audience is seeing that work. But for the most part, what you're seeing is what we were trying to show judges.
All right, awesome. So on your website, you say, or you're quoted as saying, America's so-called war on drugs is really its own unchecked addiction to incarceration. And one of the things that, or one of the ideas that gets tossed around a lot in changing how we talk about addiction is recognizing that it's an illness and not a moral failing. And the only way to treat an illness is to deal with the root cause of it. So when we're talking about mass incarceration, especially as it relates to people charged and sentenced for drug crimes, what is the root cause?
Yeah, I think that's an amazing question. I think the root cause of America's addiction to incarceration is we lack the infrastructure to adequately respond to a widespread public health crisis. And saying that today, in the middle of a pandemic, I think people sort of understand it more than when I was saying it 5 or 6 years ago. And so what we had in the mid-1980s was a very legitimate and real public health crisis related to the drug epidemic. But what happened is we responded with incarceration rather than the resources necessary to address that public health crisis, right? And so, people's sense of safety, people's sense of community erosion, all of that, gave birth to mandatory minimums in prison. It gave birth to long drug sentences in the federal system. It gave birth to the abolition of parole. We don't have parole. And so I think to unpack and undo that, we have to get to the root cause of why we abolished parole, why we started using formulaic, numbers-based sentences to put human beings in cages. And we have to talk about, I'm going to say a word I think a lot of people have heard recently, and defunding, right? And so we have to talk about how neighborhoods were defunded, how mental health was defunded, how drug programs were defunded. Defunding has been happening for a very long time, particularly in Black communities and in poor communities. That's not new. And so America's addiction to incarceration is also the result of defunded solutionary responses to a very real public health crisis.
Right. And for me, at least, because I work with a group of guys who are sentenced for things a little more serious than drug crimes, but still they served their sentences, which were later commuted. And a lot of times when I'm talking about that work, there's a lot of pushback, especially when you talk about defunding the police and defunding carceral institutions. So I wonder if post-80s, post-Reagan era, we haven't created a feedback loop where the way that we talk about incarcerated people and the way that we treat them as numbers, problems to be solved, doesn't also create the societal pushback against conversations about defunding and police reform and even abolition.
Absolutely. I certainly think that, when we look at the alchemy and the ingredients for how we got here, I think the dehumanization of people is at the core of that. And I also think at the core of it is this sense that there are, binaries in the criminal judicial system, right? That like the line between drug dealer and addict exists, right? And what I've seen in many of the people who I've represented, they were affected and harmed by the drug epidemic before they were prosecuted for perpetuating it. And so I think like getting down into the nuance of that is very important as well. Because, many times people don't just wake up and decide, I'm going to just sell drugs today because that sounds fun. It's not fun. It's dangerous. And it's not profitable. And so some of which we can talk about, some of the dominant carceral myths around drug policy in America feed into the system of addiction to incarceration because we don't challenge them, right? So one of those myths is that, people who sell drugs get rich and they're flashy. And, and I think when I look at some of my guys who've been in prison for 25 years and at best made $25,000, they're a lot. The hourly rate is, fractional. And so I think challenging that mythology around incarceration is very important. Challenging the dehumanization of people is very important. And that's where I think the work has to go.
So in challenging the way that people who commit crimes, criminalized people, are portrayed and even talked about, do you feel that the media has a very distinct role and responsibility in changing that conversation? Because even now, and I'm guilty of this, there's talk of another Law and Order show, this time focused on Chris Maloney's character, Detective Elliot Stabler, who's something of a cultural icon. And even I love the character, fully recognizing that the entire Law and Order universe is propaganda. It's designed to make people empathize with and maybe become less critical of the police, even knowing that characters like Detective Stabler are dangerous and they frequently work outside of the law.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I think the media has a role in decarceration because the media has had a longstanding role, as you just pointed out, in, perpetuating incarceration and perpetuating some of these myths about law and order. And so, but the media is also a conduit for the culture, right? And so people access the culture and consume the culture largely through media, through social media, print media, visual and digital media. So I absolutely believe that there is a place for the media. I think when we look back at the history of the war on drugs, it was a cultural event that largely started and sparked the shift in America's drug policy, and that is the death of Lynn, standout basketball player who was drafted, I think, #1 in the 1984-85 draft, and then overdosed on cocaine the night that he was selected to play for the Celtics. That was a cultural event, and it became a flashpoint in which Congress met, and without hearings, without taking evidence, passed these very draconian and harsh drug laws and said that they were reacting to this cultural event and what was believed to have been the start of, a growing drug epidemic, right? So culture has always been in conversation with our lawmakers, with people, with voters. And so I definitely think the media plays a role in the way in which we understand policy in America.
So this has become something of a flashpoint, especially as we call back to the 80s and the so-called war on drugs. But the language around drug users has changed so drastically in the last 10, even the last 5 years. It's now person-first language. It's an illness. It's no longer a moral failing. We're talking about harm reduction. And a lot of people, and rightly so, have pointed out that the language only shifted with the shift in the demographic of who we're focusing on. So in the 80s and in the 90s, when we were talking about the crack epidemic, it was largely Black and brown communities, especially poor Black and brown communities. And this was at a time when unemployment was rampant in those communities. So we're talking about the lowest on the socioeconomic hierarchy. And now, as we move into the opioid crisis, it's no longer the crack epidemic, but it's a crisis, and it's specifically related to opioids in largely white communities. And the face of that particular drug crisis, it's not Black and brown anymore, it's white people. Do you think that that demographic shift has made your work easier in a sense because people are more willing to listen to it and listen to what you have to say?
No, not at all. I think that first of all, there was an opioid epidemic well before this most recent iteration of it. There was an opioid epidemic when Black and brown men who served in the military came back from war and were struggling with addiction. It just wasn't called an epidemic. So, I think just when we start the clock on what is an epidemic is interesting to me. But to your question, no, I don't think it has made the work easier. It is still extremely difficult, and that's because there are multiple levers that are happening in this apparatus, right? And so, yeah, we're talking about the opioid epidemic, but we also still have unfair crack sentencing, right? Yes, we're talking about the marijuana industry and the legalization of marijuana, but we still have people serving mandatory life without parole in prison for marijuana. And so, I think for me, it's always been about, the language is shifting, the recognition is shifting, but is it looking back at the people who were buried alive and fossilized? And it is still extremely difficult to save those lives. So I'm rarely impressed with the change in language as long as there are people still in prison.
So it's a perfect lead into my next question, something of a contentious issue, but with the election of Joe Biden, which I think for a lot of people felt like a breath of fresh air. It felt like, okay, I don't have to care so much anymore in terms of political activism. But for a lot of people, especially a lot of Black people, they remember a time when Joe Biden and a lot of prominent Democrats were the loudest voices calling for the incarceration and the lifetime incarceration of people who are still sitting in prison for criminalized offenses that those same Democrats are now calling for the legalization and the decriminalization of. Does it ever feel kind of like a slap in the face? Or does it ever feel like, well, what about all of the people that you put in prison? Why are you not also advocating for them now?
I think for me, I look at it more broadly because it's bigger than Joe Biden. It's just like what we just lived through was bigger than Trump. It's largely a failing of the reformist movements, right? It's a failing. In movement work, I'm always cautious of embracing reformation as the goal, right? And so, for example, what we see now in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen a growing use of the term criminal justice reform. And no one can sort of trace why that language is taken on, but it's deeply powerful in that it sets the goal, I think, at the 50-yard line rather than in the end zone, right? Because, we never would have said that we were fighting for slavery reform or segregation reform. But when talking about mass incarceration, suddenly we just want reform. And if that's what we are asking for, then that's what we will get. And what reform looks like for my work is you might see a change in law going forward, right? And so you'll see Congress get together, they'll pass a law and says, from this day forward, people who are sentenced for crack, there won't be 100-to-1 disparity between their punishments with powder. It'll just be 18-to-1, right? And that'll be your reform, because you're just sort of slightly tinkering with the apparatus. And then there'll be a press conference about it, and people will be very proud of themselves. And everyone will have gotten reform, because that's what we asked for. I think if we're really freedom loving and really, radically reimagining what system we want to build, it's not a reform system. It's to abolish mass incarceration. And that's the conversation that I am happy to have with the Biden administration or whoever is in office. Not just simply reforming and tinkering and a few people get out of prison, or even a lot of people get out of prison and a few people are left there. I think the moral legitimacy of the system depends upon the laws going forward, which is reform, but also whether the law looks back. And as long as we have people who are sitting in prison for life for marijuana, as long as we have people who are sitting in prison for life for drugs, who are not dangerous, then we have not reached the end zone. And I think that people's recollection of the story of drug policy in America is largely correct. Like, people know their lawmakers passed laws that damage communities. And so, I think that part of what the conversation has been recently is, well, maybe we misunderstand. Like, no, we know these laws were passed. We know they were formulaic, and we know that they decimated communities that largely were sold as being solutionary responses to the drug epidemic, but they really just accelerated the problem. And so I always start with, honoring the political memory of people in community. And then moving that conversation to, okay, how do we undo the misstep? And so I think that's going to be the conversation that needs to occur with this administration.
So whenever the topic of abolition, whether that's abolition of the police or abolition of mass incarceration, which in my opinion are two sides of the same coin, but during these conversations, the question always comes up, well, what do our communities look like once those institutions no longer exist? What's the alternative to calling the police?
It's interesting because, I lived in Chicago for many years, and I know the alternatives to calling the police, because like we often feel like we can't call the police because the police, it's weaponizing the police against our own communities. And so, but I think that your core question is what after, right? Like, what do we build after? And it's a nuance for me, because I am definitely a mass incarceration abolitionist. Absolutely, full stop. And I don't think that it's as difficult as we might hear and believe in order to get there, because it's an undoing of how we got here. I do believe that dismantling prisons has to occur, and if it is to occur, it has to occur with dismantling white supremacy, because there's a deep and true piece of me that sees police murdering Black people and does not want them on the street. I don't want that, I want them incapacitated and punished. And so I think, for me, it's always been about, if we're going to abolish prisons, we got to do that and abolish white supremacy and systems of oppression. Otherwise, we're already at the point where there are no consequences to violence against our communities that are exacted by the state. And so I think just having that conversation is very important. I definitely believe in restorative justice. I employ and use that in my practice because, I think that beginners to the conversation about justice use terms like nonviolent drug offender, violent versus nonviolent. And that's a missed opportunity. You know, I am the daughter of an addict. And, you know, there was a time growing up where, you know, I felt like the person who sold my parent drugs was exacting an act of violence against my family. It felt very violent. I also now, you know, the work that I'm doing is my way of restorative justice. It is my conversation with forgiveness. And I have deep conversations with my clients who I represent about, you know, what do you want to do in the community if you were not in prison? And I think for a lot of them, the people that they have become over the years is their way of apologizing. And what they do when they're released is their way of apologizing. And that's restorative justice. And so I think that for me is where we start, you know, moving away from some of the sort of binary categorical language like nonviolent drug offender, and having a real conversation about how can people contribute to their communities in real ways. So in the film, you know, Edward Douglas, who was released from prison after 15 years, he was serving a mandatory life sentence for selling, you know, what was the equivalent of a golf ball of crack to a confidential informant. And, you know, he got out of prison. What you saw in the movie was that within weeks, he's going to Washington, D.C., advocating for the men and women he left behind in prison. And, you know, calling him a nonviolent drug offender doesn't even begin to capture that contribution to the public conversation about drug policy and about justice. He's not just some nonviolent drug offender, right? Like, he's a change agent and a thought partner and someone who I'm proud to stand next to and stand behind many times as he advocates for people. And so I think that's what's most important. Like, each of us is a restorative justice advocate and agent.
So you answered this a little bit, but anytime we talk about mass incarceration and abolition, the question always comes up, how do we respond to violent offenses? How do we respond to people that hurt other people? What do we do with them if we can't put them in prisons? And I often wonder if that's not, it's well-intentioned, but it's also diminishing the impact of other people's response to crime. Because as you said, someone whose parents died of an overdose, they may feel that the person that sold their parent drugs committed an act of violence. Mm-hmm. So the categorization of some criminalized acts as more violent than others, or some people as non-violent versus violent, to me it often feels like it falls short, and it feels like part of the problem when we have these conversations.
Right. I think my first response to your question is, you know, going back to some of the dominant carceral mythologies that we've all been fed. One of those myths is that people are in prison to keep us safer, and that we are safer with certain people in prison. Let's take Edward Douglas, for example. You know, what wasn't covered in the film was that he was set up by a confidential informant, right? Edward had no prior convictions for violence, what anyone would argue would be violence. He had never had any conviction for harming another person. His first strike was marijuana. It was possession of marijuana in the 80s. His second strike was possession of a personal use amount of cocaine in the 90s. And those two strikes were used along with the third strike to imprison him for life. What I always think is interesting is for lack of a better term, the snitch, the cooperating informant, right? And in Edward's case, that person had prior convictions for murder, attempted murder, burglary, And so, I think we've always said America should just do what it says it does and what it put on paper, right? And so if the idea is the system is to operate to make us safer, then the person who gets the cooperation coupon should not be the one who has the prior convictions for violence, like attempted murder, right? So it's hard for me to take those questions seriously, given how I've seen how the system operates in the courtroom and at the podium. It doesn't prioritize incarcerating the person who has demonstrated a greater propensity to harm others, right? It doesn't. I think that, anyone comparing these two men would say the one who's been convicted of attempted murder should not be the one who's getting the cooperation coupon to get out of jail free by putting a guy who has no prior convictions for violent offenses or what people would deem dangerous. So that just doesn't make sense. And, I've heard detractors and critics of justice bills or mass incarceration abolition say just that. Like, what do we do with all the dangerous people? I think we should start with not allowing them to put non-dangerous people in prison. And once we do that, then we can have a deeper conversation about community safety. But it's similar to me of like the response to what about black on black crime? You're not really concerned about black on black crime. You're concerned about detracting and pivoting the conversation, right? And so we're not really concerned yet about public safety as long as we have a prosecutorial system that doesn't prioritize that in every case.
So I want to shift gears a little bit because as I said before, I work with a group of guys who were sentenced to life in prison as juveniles, and they've had their sentences commuted. For a lot of them, they say that their time in prison, it made them a different person. They became quieter, they became more introspective. They had a chance to reflect on the ways that they harmed their community, all of those sorts of things. And I love all of those guys a great deal. I enjoy working with them, but I often wonder if those sorts of stories don't contribute to the idea that we can't let people out of prison until they become remorseful and they're racked with guilt, or letting them out encourages them to continue harming their communities.
Yeah. I mean, I think, one of the things I was very sensitive to in the film and also in my work is not watering this narrative of, the happy, smiling, survivor of prison trauma. Like, people like to see the system, like to see people survive the system with a smile on their face. And I think the fact that, Edward Douglas or any number of guys who I've worked with still has their human spirit and human dignity intact is it's a commentary about them, and it's not a commentary about the system that attempted to kill them. Because a life sentence is, a death in prison sentence. And so it certainly, can't be the perverse case where the system attempts to put you in a box and bury you there. You survive somehow through survivorship, through, your family support. And then the system then says, look what we did. We created this beautiful survivor. You weren't supposed to live through that. And so, I think that's very important, just in acknowledging that what you see in the film that's endogenous to Mr. Douglas. I also believe that, the Supreme Court has said in 2013 that, prisons are not for rehabilitation. That's what the U.S. versus Taffet. You can't impose a sentence just to rehabilitate someone. And so we're out of the rehabilitation business. We're out of that. The conditions in which the men that you work with and the men that I work with that helped them tap into an important part of themselves, those conditions need to be replicated outside of the prison space. It should not be the case that you have to go to prison to experience quiet, to experience programming, to experience stillness, to experience a space where you can read. But all of that goes back to the defunding and divestment of those resources in the community, right? And so it's sort of like that dysfunctional relationship that we may have where, the person will take everything from us and then provide a little bit and portray itself as the benefactor, right? And we've got to create spaces outside of prison to do all those things that your guys are saying that they needed and found there.
Yeah, this is less of a question, more of an observation, but whenever people counter these conversations with, well, what about reform? We can fix it. I always say you can't fix something that works as intended. All of these systems are interconnected. So when you pull money out of Black schools, there's a reason they call it the school to prison pipeline. You're taking away Black and brown children's opportunities to seek gainful employment. You're taking away their ability to find socioeconomic growth. You're taking away their opportunity to move out of the poverty cycle. There's really no other option for them but to go to prison and or to wind up dead.
Yeah, I certainly think that no one has yet, for me, identified the moment in time, month, date, and year when criminal justice was born in America, when we didn't have the fugitive slave laws, where we didn't have bodies being drugged from jails in the South and hung from trees, where we didn't have people being shot down in the street for being revolutionaries. And so I haven't been convinced that you could reform an idea that has not yet been born. I do believe, it's my hope, it is my life's work to be a doula and a midwife into creating justice in America. If I did not believe that was possible, I could not get up and do this work. I would find something else to devote my breaths to. But I believe it is a being born. It is a birthing. And we experience the contractions and then we keep pushing and we have to keep pushing. And so I hope that people, when they watch this film, see that. Because that to me is the force. It is that the will of human spirit, the audacity to survive a life sentence, the audacity of a group of women to scratch concrete and say, give us this person back. And then we're going to go back in and give us another person. And we're going to keep doing that. Even when you're tired, even when, I've missed birthdays, holidays, life events, but you keep doing it because you believe in what you're creating.
Yeah, and I think that's a really perfect way to move towards the ending of this conversation, unfortunately, because I could talk about this all day with you. But in my experience, I think the greatest joy in this work is seeing people come home to their communities, come back to their families, come back to lives that in a lot of ways have stalled for them, but for their family and their friends outside, life has gone on as normal. So even just the small things, like one of the guys that I work with will call me because their computer needs to update and they can't figure out how to do it, or they need help opening an email attachment. For me, those are the little things that bring the most joy, because for me at least, it's you're living, you've returned to life. And
Yeah, I think that, in every one of my guys, obviously they're the primary beneficiary of the win, but we are all collateral beneficiaries. The fact that Edward is a commissioner for a citywide softball league in Chicago, mentoring, in conversation, like that's real. And so I feel richer. Like this to me is our trust fund, right? And that has to lead the work, right? I always want to see my guys getting free, but I'm very, very personally invested in it too, because I feel like our trust fund is locked away in a vault. And I want that back.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the idea of the trust fund. The little, absolute minuscule amount that I put into this work is paid back 10 times over every time someone walks out of an institution and they never have to go back again.
Yeah. I think one thing that just this pandemic has shown us is that we are all so interconnected in ways that we cannot see. And that, something I've always felt, like someone else's incarceration is affecting me in ways I might not always realize, but like that suffering is affecting me. The community suffering is affecting me, and the community's joy affects me, and so I want to see that spreading.
That is the perfect note to end on. I want to thank you so much for spending just a little bit of time with me today.
Thank you for having me, Adrienne.
Could you tell the people where they can keep up with the work that you're doing?
Yes. I love when people reach out to me on Instagram. I am at Lawyer My Angel. It's spelled MIANGEL, not MY. My mother wants to be unique. And so if you find me at Lawyer My Angel on Instagram, people DM me all the time. You can also follow our work at the decarcerationcollective.org. We post a lot there. You can see my team of lawyers who I work with. And I love the conversation. I want to hear people what you thought about the film. It's available on Apple TV. If you just search for The Third Strike, you can download and watch it there. And I'm so grateful for our collective participation in this conversation.
Well, thank you so much. And I am on both Twitter and Instagram at Adrie, ADRIE Rising, RISING, all one word. Follow at your own risk. But thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much to everyone who watched and followed along with us.
Thank you.